So I want to thank everybody for their resilience and staying. And as you might expect, this is definitely the cherry on top, talking to Karl. So yeah, thank you.
Well, I should say it's really my honor to be here and quite humbling to share the stage with Garry. And so I'm just thrilled to be able to talk about this. And I thought that the session today and yesterday was just phenomenal and built on a great track record of success that Sol had last year. And in conversations in between the two sessions, I had talked to Garry about this idea of maybe trying a way forward that might help synchronize the efforts of all the folks involved here and the various foundations. And in fact, there was a sync meeting a couple days ago that Sol hosted with sort of that in mind, and it was very encouraging. So I thought maybe I'd get a chance to chat with you all about the what I call the UAP Hilbert problems, which in some sense are an intent to suggest a way forward on the phenomenon. And so the idea, and a lot of people probably know David Hilbert, right? So famous German mathematician. He is the namesake for Hilbert space, which was the idea of formalizing the ability of differentiable functions to multiple dimensions. He framed 10 problems that formed the basis and direction for theoretical mathematics for over a century. And so we're sort of kind of suggesting the problems might align in that same vein. It's interesting, though, the problems still remain. There's actually 23 that he ultimately ended up publishing, and there was a 24th that was posthumous. And over time, people solved a lot of these. Some of them were actually solved quite quickly. Some were determined to be like insoluble. Some, like the Riemann hypothesis with prime numbers, is one of the major challenges. Cantor's theorem for the cardinality of the continuum was found to be like ill-formed, an ill-formed problem. And then some sort of problems about the shortest distance between 2 points was actually a problem. So in some sense, what we're saying is even Hilbert didn't quite get the problems right, but it still had a benefit to kind of frame the way forward. So that's sort of the idea here. So we've got, let's see if this thing works. Does it work? Oh, yeah. It doesn't do it there, but does it up there? All right, so this is sort of the obligatory sort of campaign plan slide that basically shows the lines of effort. And so the premise here is, like, what are we trying to accomplish? And so I would submit that we're trying to accomplish the restoration of proper elected official oversight on the topic, progress on the topic in terms of scientific advancement, and this idea of controlled disclosure, which is a way to mitigate the potential for catastrophic consequence. And so there's sort of 5 phases and sort of 5 lines of effort that, you know, as a conceptual model, one might consider germane to the problem. And so I would submit for consideration of the group that the government probably has the best information and the most information related to the topic. And so the quickest path to success in some sense would be, let's get the government to do what we want the government to do. And so that sort of line of effort A is sort of intending to be that. The political advocacy, the policy development, et cetera. So the subsequent lines of effort, B, C, D, and E, are private sector efforts, things that are directly impactable by the folks in the audience and work that probably has already started in some sense. So maybe we'll walk through some of these and frame some ideas on how these things might contribute to making progress. So let's see, okay, yeah. So I'll talk about this slide a little bit and then maybe turn it back to Garry as we walk through some of the other problem sets. So this is the government line of effort. So Hilbert only had 24 problems, and so I ended up actually having 30 here, so you got to suffer through maybe 6 more problems. But So the first couple problems really get at, one thing I should probably say is these problems sort of align with the elements of national power. And so the Department of Defense kind of uses acronyms for everything. So we've got an acronym for the elements of national power, like we've got acronyms for everything. So we've got this acronym called DIME, which is diplomatic, information, military, and economic. And then because that wasn't good enough, they came up with like an appendage. So there's internal and external sovereignty. And so DIME is sort of your external elements of power, right, dealing with other countries. And then you've got what they call FIL, so the acronym's DIME FIL. There's finance, intelligence, law enforcement, and then there's a political element. So that's DIME FIL P. So you got like 8 elements of national power. So I'm only giving you 6 here. But we're going to get into some of the economic elements as we're going through. So you can see from a policy standpoint and from an information standpoint, the idea that there's got to be a control group that's recreated to manage this function. So the problem is like, how do you actually do that? And how do you actually centralize information on the topic such that progress can be made? And so the UAP Disclosure Act was intending to do that with the UAP Review Board. And what actually ended up getting passed technically last year is the idea of consolidating all the records at the National Archive. Unfortunately, the definitions were dropped, so the subject matter, the content, the scope of that archive is really probably continues to be a little suspect. But so that's sort of the first 2 problems. They still remain to be solved, ultimately, is what I'm saying. The second one, or the third one is basically your finance. And so the idea of the financial piece is really how do you incentivize grant money to maybe impact this problem so the academic community can get engaged in a more aggressive way. And so that's probably some reforms that are going to be required through the National Science Foundation. And then if you think about ultimately trying to move into the diplomatic sphere, you've got to kind of understand not only like the domestic side of the equation, but you have to understand the foreign policy side. And so the idea of what would it take to understand the public and private positions of every government with respect to the topic, as well as the state of affairs, perhaps, of any RDT&E, research, development, test, evaluation programs of a foreign nation. So there's this thing called an NIE, National Intel Estimate, that might do that. And then ultimately, that might lead to an international forum like the Reagan-Gorbachev Forum or the World Congress of Religions that might ultimately end up trying to address, sort of a whole planet issue. So that's maybe the government line of effort, Hilbert problems. Like, how do we get a handle from a government standpoint? But a lot of folks, are probably more interested in what might happen, both in the humanities. So we've got 6 problems with humanities. We've got 6 problems with the natural sciences. We've got 6 problems with industry and society, and then another 6 sort of in healthcare. And so the idea with the humanities, number 1 would be like sort of administrative. How do you set up an administrative structure that the academy can engage on this topic? And so, obviously folks in the audience are going to have probably a much better idea how to do that than I might, but as a going-in position, maybe you'd want to create specialties within these existing disciplines and ultimately, endow chairs and heads of departments that would sort of support this effort. So that's sort of a big ask, but the Hilbert problems weren't necessarily that easy to begin with. So the idea maybe would be, instead of creating a degree program on UAP or having a specific set of lectures on UAP, it becomes like sort of a specialty of each of the disciplines. And let's see, are we on the right side? So the ethical piece is also an interesting one. And we've got like a theory of ethics based on this, the fundamental principle of like do no harm and do the greatest good. And in some sense, that seems to presuppose actors with equal competitive potential in terms of their effectiveness in navigating the society. And so if the norm is a hierarchy of being where you've got non-human intelligence that might be more advanced, technologically more evolved, in terms of their development, it would seem that in concert with that would become a greater responsibility to protect. So the idea of conservation laws driving a competition is balanced by the idea that greater capability would really bring a moral responsibility as well. Just like we've got laws of armed conflict where there's sort of limits on what you can do. So we've got the sort of maybe the special relativity version of ethics. We need to get to the general relativity version of ethics, and so that's sort of what that's getting at. But maybe I'll shoot it over to Garry on the next two, the sort of sociology and the history aspects. There's this potential for ontological shock of phenomena that people aren't comfortable with, and how best might we manage that?
So, my thought about the ontological shock in history is, I think somehow we have to look back into history on how it was that humanity resolved the notion of non-human intelligence in our environment. Religions have been talking about everything from angels to demons or spirits, etc. And I think the common thread that I've seen everything from prehistory to today is whatever this thing is that might be being represented to us is basically saying there is another. But depending upon your cultural framework, it represents itself in different manners, depending upon the time. So I'm not saying that that's true. I'm just saying that that appears to be a way to resolve the continuity, but is that what we will need to consider moving forward? If today what we think we see as technology is tomorrow it going to be something else? So what is that going to be?
Precisely. Yeah. So it seemed like there's examples in the past on how to navigate this, and maybe we need to avail of those examples in terms of setting up a direction going forward.
Right.
And it seems to me that there's a role for actually the discipline of sociology to sort of map out the potential likelihood of the idea of like false authority syndrome or stagnation of initiative. The War of the Worlds sort of hysteria, like what is the real probability of any of those kind of occurring, and how one might sort of mitigate those as being significant. And ultimately, the idea here is solving some of these problems, even theoretically, and having a serious conversation about them, ultimately might feed back into lowering the threshold for the government to come forward with information. Because essentially there's sort of 6 reasons for, possible for non-disclosure. The national security reason's pretty well understood. Everybody sort of appreciates that. But there's just this idea that there's lack of a plan. Like once you announce non-human intelligence, all of a sudden there's thousands of questions, like what are you going to do about that?
Right. Okay, well, what would you do?
Well, exactly, right. So in some sense, like it's not a government problem.
Right.
Right. Which is really kind of the point of these problems here, which is most of these issues dealing with the plan are addressable in the private sector. Right. So like if there's a sociological issue, like let's solve that in the sociological disciplines. If there's like an ethical issue, right? If there's a economic issue, which we'll get into ultimately.
Well, I think pivoting off of that, what Riz was talking about earlier, when I was sitting listening to what Riz was talking about, you might say, well, why are you preparing for something that we don't even know is going to happen yet? And yet, if you don't have that preparation, right, that's also going back to this morning with Matt Pines, if there's the 1% chance of complete societal disruption, not just monetary or governmental, then isn't it the purpose of academics to have some of these hypotheses set up and at least potential war-gamed out answers for them? And so, to me at least, preparing for that and having these kinds of discussions and making it safe to have this kind of a discussion is really what the purpose of all of this is about.
Precisely. So like this next one, the history one is like, if NHI exists, has it interacted with humanity over time, right? So it's sort of an open question. This is the classic chariots of the gods sort of scenario. Well, I wouldn't necessarily endorse any of the use cases in that book. The question still presents itself: if NHI exists, And whether we count it in the future or whether we encounter it in the present, you'd want to know, has there been interaction in the past? And so it would, I think, behoove historians and cultural anthropologists to sort of look into that, because that's something we'd want to understand our own human condition.
Well, what kind of discontinuities would you expect to see that would represent something in the past?
Well, so it's interesting to sort of throw out like sort of this interesting hypothetical. They recently, there's this idea of out-of-place artifacts, right, that you probably heard about. And so there's pre-dynastic Egyptian vases that date to like 3000 BC. And Flinders Petrie actually found these. And they're kind of hoarded in Zoser's pyramid, like so it dates to like 3rd, 4th dynasty. And they've got like 10,000 of them in there. And they've got some of these in the Egyptian Museum. And they're the ones that I'm talking about, they're made out of granite and schist, corundum, which is like one level below diamond in the hardness. Well, they've been around for years. Flinders Petrie found them in the 1890s. They finally decided to mensurate one, like with lasers, strain gauges, and they determined that the profile is accurate within 1,000th of an inch of a mathematical equation. So, like, you can't make this object by hand.
Was it round? It couldn't be accomplished on a lathe?
Right, but the diameters correspond to a closed-form algorithm.
Oh, okay.
Right, and the features of the vase, the fillets, the rounds, it has handles on it. You've got to have like a 3-axis or 4-axis like milling machine to make this. And it's made out of granite. They've got others that are schist, so they're very brittle. They got some out of corundum. So nobody really knows how this is made. The Egyptologists basically say that they made it with grounding powder and on a potter's wheel or something. But it's impossible to make this object in that way. So that doesn't mean it's NHI, obviously, but it means that like the scientific community hasn't engaged with that object, and there's either like an entire material culture associated with that is lost, like the Antikythera mechanism. Had we not found that, nobody would believe that they could make that.
Right.
So I think that what we're saying here in this history, problem is some of these things deserve a relook, and to understand where we came from, we probably need to do that.
Well, I think it comes to the whole data off the curve problem, is that all the discoveries that were ever made, really of any significance, and many of the Nobel Prizes that are given out are always things that were off the curve, and so I think it just merits. I don't think it, again, it's this whole threshold of how much time and effort you put into an anomaly versus all of the other things that could be done. And so it's one of those things you put on the shelf until the point in time comes when it's like somebody realizes, now I see it.
But there's also opportunity space there too, right? So it's sort of a trade. Like maybe it's a risky endeavor, but it also is maybe career enhancing if you're successful.
Or career destroying.
Correct, right. As the case may be.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. How about religious studies? So I was privileged to be on a talk with Daniel Pasulka at a recent conference, and we talked a little bit about how the Orthodox faith traditions are very dissimilar, but the more esoteric versions have some similarity. And, through this sort of initiatic experience. And so one wonders, as a lot of experiencers report, like altered states of consciousness and, near-death experience like encounters, was there any interaction in the past in terms of religion? And, what would that mean, have NHI interacted in that way and that become public? And what would that mean ultimately for government disclosure, right? So there's maybe a linkage there.
Well, you could imagine the legs of, if certain legs of certain religions get pulled out from underneath them, there would be considerable accusations of heathenism.
Right. And so this is the potential for also the societal disruption aspect. And so, it remains to be seen if any of that's true, but as a responsible policymaker, you'd have to probably entertain that. So this is a problem that would be great to definitively resolve it perhaps in the negative.
But I want to challenge this whole notion of hysteria that, I think unfortunately for most of the world's population, they're too busy putting bread on the table. So to the extent that it would be news for a certain cycle, or period of time, I don't think it would change people's need to continue to put bread on the table. You know, if anything, they will say, well, I don't have time to deal with that right now. So that to me is a sort of a buffer in the system.
Right. Well, in the next phase, I think in the 2 slides from now, we're going to get into the economic impact,
Right.
and we probably should discuss maybe
Okay.
if that's got a ramification
Sure.
as well. But why don't we go to the natural sciences? So Avi had talked about this, and Garry, you did too in a previous discussion, like this whole data collection and data citability issue. You know, there's a lot of, let's say, data out there, but is the quality of the data sufficient to be usable? And is the accessibility of that data and the development of large language models, you know, efficacious enough to draw anything out in terms of evidence, right? And so maybe you'd like to kind of comment further on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm excited about with data, and I can speak to it from my cancer biology background, you know, we've been producing, and my laboratory has been, you know, responsible in a, let's say it even a negative way, of producing so much data that we can't make meaning of it. And then suddenly we have the whole corpus of the scientific literature at our disposal. And if you context the question in just the right way, and in some of my talks I literally say it's actually a Zen Buddhist saying that the more perfect the question, the more easily obtainable is the answer. It's almost like an information space problem. And by being able to context the question with raw data, literally raw data, simply comma delimited, suddenly out of the morass of the statistical relationships in the large language models arises the answers that, and put into context, that I wish my best graduate students or postdocs could accomplish. And it has to do with these things called chain of thought. And we basically create like a scientist who thinks like, this is how a scientist thinks, here's how a scientist postulates, here's how a scientist develops questions. And so using that kind of an approach, I could imagine now coming to the data collection that, for instance, Jonathan is producing, and collecting it out of either the raw data from the Galileo project or putting that together with the contextual information in the literature and saying, okay, find the pattern and give me the answer. Because, you know, just as little as 2 years ago, and I've had these many conversations with Jacques Vallée about it, he would say, the artificial intelligence is garbage in, garbage out. Well, it turns out that garbage in with AI can actually clean up and become signal out of apparent noise, because there is relationships within that data. And so that's what I think is an opportunity in data collection, is that data collection with metadata correlations will allow you with these contextualizations to arise, bring out the relationships you didn't even know were there, as Jonathan showed a couple of examples of this afternoon.
And you've kind of thrown out a challenge problem several times, which is like, what's the best evidence and what's the best data? Mm-hmm. And, you know, aggregating all of that so other scholars and researchers can use it, can jumpstart the whole process. Right. In a way, hopefully that's citable, and you could actually build, you know, papers and subsequent research off of.
You know, and I think what, you know, again, Avi showed with the ability, let's say, to collect 500,000 or 500 million data points is, you know, just as little as last year, people would say, well, that's nice, but I don't have the terabytes to deal with it, to hold it. And yet, almost all of human knowledge can be now distilled with these large language models down to just a few terabytes, which is just remarkable to think about. So to me, having that much data is no longer a problem. Now it's just, do you have the compute resources to ask questions of it? But the flip side of that is, just as I said before, if you don't have the right question, you'll never find the right answer. And so that's what I think we need to challenge ourselves for, is what kind of data do we really want to have? How much cleaning of the data do we need to do? And then what would be the questions that we ask of it to help it give us an answer? Like, is there a discontinuity in the historical record that would, or I get asked this question a lot, is there a hybrid program? And as a geneticist, my answer is, even if there was, it would be so sophisticated you'd never see it in the data because it's just too complicated to expect to find that. So don't ask me.
Right, right. Well, in some sense too, like the sort of the statistical analysis that says, we hear about UFO waves and UAP waves. Like, where's the canonical data set that shows that? There's a lot of, let's say, anecdotal information and certainly witness testimony that's a correlation between UAP and nuclear sites, but where's the definitive data set that shows that, right? So what's the temporal, geospatial, geopolitical, even celestial, geophysical kind of correlations, right? Does it correlate with Earth lights? Does it correlate with, politics? Does it correlate with, troop movements? Like, what does it correlate to?
And I think what that calls into a need for is there going to be eventually a database of databases? Because, even at the meeting in the last couple of days, I've had people say, well, we're collecting this on experiencers, or we're collecting this type of data, or this kind of data, and I hear the same data sets being collected in 4 or 5 different places. And so that's repetitive action that doesn't need to be done. But on one hand, you'd hope that those databases validate each other, and they're at best you'd hope that they're synergistic.
Right, right. So sort of moving down sort of the problem list, there's sort of the hard science, physics, material science. You talked about biology a little bit, but so if we think about material science, Richard Feynman sort of talked about this idea of room at the bottom, right? And it seems like technology's finally getting to the point where we can
You should explain what he meant by that.
Oh, right. So he was pretty much saying that there's opportunity to engineer at the molecular level. We can actually there's more opportunity space in terms of science, material science, and technology at the molecular level than at the macrostructural level. And it seems like we're finally getting to the stage where that's sort of viable. Like, we've been doing that in semiconductor for decades. We've done that obviously in genomics. But as this becomes more widely possible, the barriers to these disciplines seem to be eroding, and the possibility of creating a material infrastructure that's really, engineered. And so the idea of programmable matter and information and material science start to merge. Some more advanced civilization may have already gotten to that stage.
So I think the true Hilbert problem here in material science is, there's form and function. So form defines the function. So we don't yet know how to make certain kinds of materials. I can put the atoms there, let's say, but I don't necessarily have the ability to make the atomic structure bonds that are required to create the necessary structure to carry out the function. And so the Hilbert problem here is, and so this is sort of like a challenge to material scientists at large, is how do you create ab initio the positioning of 2 atoms and then a bond at a macro level in a material in 3D. You can't just print them like clay dots, or like even the more advanced printing of 3D materials today. We're still sintering stuff, melting it onto itself or polymerizing it onto itself. So how do we make a superconductor, which anybody who's seen some of those zeolite-like structures that look like these beautiful 3D objects, how are you going to print that? And if we are dealing with materials, as some people claim exist from such objects, where they seem to be made almost as if they were instantiated out of the quantum foam at desire, what kind of technology is required to accomplish that? And yeah, I don't have a materializer yet, but what would be the steps along the way to get to the materializer?
Right. And so you'd essentially have the ability to analyze and then maybe ultimately replicate.
Well, and that's what's interesting again about the large language models. And Deep here is in the audience who has been part of the generative loop of analyze, determine function, predict with computational models what the next thing should be, and sort of creating an evolutionary loop of materials generation. So what's missing in that loop is actually the knowledge of what reality is and what the function is. We're sort of doing a loop on function, and we're creating methods which are really cake recipes for what the next function is, and we test that. But we don't actually have a test yet for what the reality is. Did we make what we thought we made? And so analytic techniques are required for that as well. Not just determining where the atoms are, but determining what the structure of the bonds are in the material that we thought we made.
So that's sort of a good segue to the next sort of set, which is, we're going the wrong direction. There we go. For industry and society, and some of the problems that kind of might revolve around how to operationalize this in an economic sense. But first off, like we've sort of started the conversation, you've got a lot of organizations, both in the public and private sector and the nonprofit sector, that are sort of interested in the topic. How do you best synchronize those efforts?
Well, I'm going to go back, and we touched on this to what Riz was talking about, is that and actually you and I had this discussion around the UAP Disclosure Act and the eminent domain question.
Right.
And so the point was, does supposed material stay private for good reason because of security, or does it go into the public domain, or is there some middle ground?
Right. So actually, if we're going to sort of talk about that, maybe we kind of refer back to the amendment, right? So folks that might be familiar or had read the UAP Disclosure Act, there was a section in there that basically said the government is going to exercise eminent domain over technology of unknown origin and biological evidence of non-human intelligence. And so a lot of people sort of question why that was in there, since eminent domain is actually like inherent in sovereignty itself, and this has actually been litigated in the 19th century. So the fact that you have a sovereign, like the federal government or even sovereign state, eminent domain is an element of that. And so people would say, well, this is sort of controversial. If the government already has the authority, like why even include that in that law, because it just creates another contention. And so I think the reason it was included was essentially so the board that was being created, that was publicly accountable, would have unfettered access to the material in a legal sense. So just because the government has or might be able to get material, you want it to go to the board because the board is accountable to Congress. So that was sort of the first piece. The second piece is, the lore sort of talks about material being moved into the private sector, perhaps to keep it out of reach of elected officials, elected oversight. And so perhaps over decades, the ownership status sort of became fungible. Like one might argue, if all government material was subject to the board, then the material would be commercial. Mm-hmm. Or if one argued that the commercial company has to have oversight to its executive board, then they'd argue it's government.
Right.
So the eminent domain was included also to remove any doubt of the fungibility of the material.
Well, and our discussion, not argument, to you was that there is that middle ground of public-private partnership, that there would be ways to take some of the materials, let's say, supposed, alleged, although tomorrow it'll be in the Daily Mail that, I said something different, that there's that middle ground where you could create the kind of investment opportunity where, and Riz talked about some of it, but my idea was that you basically pay to get in, and then the intellectual property that might arise from it, you get to bid on it coming back out and using it, but that it's done in enough of a classified and semi-classified way or public way that you can bring in the interest of academics and create that virtuous cycle that I think we're wanting to see, or that you would want to see around any development of any technology, whether it's UAP related or not.
Right. So, well, part of the concept of eminent domain, to sort of kind of, hit the badminton ball back over to your side, would be to say that compensation is required.
Yes.
Right. And so, sort of the compensation process that might be under consideration was sort of a six-stage process, right? And so the first idea would be to grant a grace period. So you've got this board, you've got this material, and I would argue like the proof of this phenomena is sort of resident in the center of gravity of the material. by the way. Like as a segue here, there's been, witness reports, from the 50s, the 40s, even World War II. There's been some photographs. There are quite a bit of government documents that have been FOIA'd. There's some videos now. We've got a little sensor data. Like in the aggregate, it's like quite a lot. But, people still always ask, like, where's the proof, right? So in some sense, the material is going to be the center of gravity of the evidentiary path, if it exists and if the government has it. So what you would want to do is essentially manage that process through controlled disclosure with this board that would have oversight ultimately of Congress. So you want the board to have the material. And so you would grant a grace period with, let's say, the controlling authorities as this first step in the 6-step process, where you're not going to make any change, but the government's going to sort of get a handle on what they're going to do, right?
But you know what the pushback is from Twitter is, I can't wait that long. I want it tomorrow. Karl, tell everything.
Yeah. Well, right. So that gets into the catastrophic disclosure, Garry.
Right. No,
Right.
I'd be perfectly happy with that. I want to know whether to go back to my lab and do cancer research or whether I do this, which is seemingly more interesting at times.
Well. So let's run through the other 5 steps, right? So there's this sort of grace period where we're hoping that the controlling authorities are going to volunteer the material in a classified setting to the board, right? And they may have ideas on where to go looking for it, right? So they're going to give them maybe a year to kind of figure out what they're going to do. So the second part is, okay, you ought to get a finder's fee for it, and you ought to get compensated for, the expenses in securing it and in analyzing it. And, this actually bears a lot of resemblance to the law of the sea in terms of marine salvage. Right, so the idea of if you find a vessel adrift at sea, you can't just keep it for yourself, right? You got to bring it into port, and then the owner kind of gives you a finder's fee, right? It's sort of to reduce piracy, but also sort of incentivize the reintroduction of the cargo back into the streams of commerce, right? So you don't want piracy, but you want the material returned. And so this problem actually bears a lot of resemblance to that, because what we're talking about in the Schumer Amendment is specifically non-human technology. It's defined as non-human. So the owner is non-human intelligence.
So let me stop you there because it's interesting. So somebody claims that they've got something and they bring it to you, but it's non-functional. It's a piece of broken something. How do you prove that what you had was that rather than an airplane part?
Right. Well,
or a hoax.
Yeah, of course. Right. So the amendment basically says that the board's got to adjudicate that beyond reasonable doubt. The standard in the amendment is reasonable doubt. Mm-hmm. So how is the board going to do that? Well, if the controlling authority brings it forward under the statute, then they're presuming that it is non-human intelligence, or they wouldn't have brought it forward, right?
So
but if the government is claiming that, then that would have to be demonstrated, and they'd probably come to experts to do that demonstration.
So there's got to be a chain of custody. There's got to be form and or function and proof, because who's going to invest in it if there's not that associated with it? And so there has to be laws and things set up for that. So
Precisely.
that's kind of a Hilbert problem, is that
right.
it goes back to politics, and then it flips back to, and I think we all know that politics can be driven by economics. I don't mean bribery.
No, well, you want policy to incentivize societally positive behavior, right? And that's got to be informed. Mm-hmm. So just to run through sort of the other 3 components of this sort of 6-phase plan, then you're going to allow the finder of the material to retain any intellectual property that occurred before eminent domain was exercised, before this legislation had it been passed. So there's sort of incentive for that. And then the potential to get a grant to continue the research. Mm-hmm. And then maybe that IP would be co-owned with the government, right? And then finally, the implicit idea was you want to make this material available to a wider group, bring in a larger brain trust, because apparently, one might argue, as people have, that it's been sequestered away and it's not benefiting society. So you'd make it available to a consortium that might be competitively selected.
Right.
A consortium of like the best and the brightest to work on it. And oh, by the way, the original controlling authority might be competitive to participate in the consortium.
Yeah.
So that's maybe one way of doing that. And then you might move from that sort of consortium stage to more of a regulated reintroduction of this, outside the secure enclave to benefit society.
And I want to make sure that we reiterate as we're talking about this, again, because this has been a long conversation, this is in the context of wargaming out ideas. It's not because anybody up here knows one thing or the other that is or is not true, but it's sort of a late night over the bar drink conversation.
Right, that's precisely.
To the Daily Mail.
Right. Right. But in some sense, like just entertaining this conversation in a serious way makes available to the government policy options that it might not otherwise have.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's the whole idea of thinking through the problem and then saying, okay, well, here's something that maybe a paper could be written about, a white paper or what have you, that could be pointed to, because when the Senate staffers, so for instance, I've been called by Senate staffers about Havana syndrome quite a bit, given my past work in the area. And they're like, hey, can you write us a white paper on this? Because we hadn't heard about this, and there hadn't been anything out there. So, and only because I'd been involved with it was I able to write something like that, and it ended up influencing policy.
Precisely. And, how would you incentivize like collaboration on this topic in terms of also how like the monetary reward or compensation would flow? And so for instance, like, if you actually had this exotic material, right? Mm-hmm. And so the upside would be tremendous, but even in a consortium of, companies that are working on it, there might be the desire to stovepipe.
So the first thing I would do, frankly, I mean, as much as the economics is important, is I would incentivize the science. Because the science is, you can incentivize with money all you want, but that's only going to get necessarily greedy scientists at the table. And I would rather that somehow it is brought out that there are principles within these objects that are dozens of technology revolutions ahead of us, and that any one of those revolutions would be as big as the transistor was. And so we don't have to worry about what the long-term function of the object is, but that if we find within it a principle that could excite a whole new generation of scientists, that would be sufficient to have brought the stuff out of the warehouse in the first place. Right.
So should we talk about, in the last couple of minutes,
yep,
the healthcare aspect? Do we want to do that? Sort of this kind of tees off on the experiencer aspect of the thing. And so the idea of like wellness and health sort of comes into play in terms of potentially the ontological or psychological impacts that might come from interaction, but also if there's sort of a public revelation, there could be societal impacts as well. And so, in a sociological sense, that's sort of theoretical, but in the sort of prophylactic and medical healthcare side, would you have any comments on that?
Well, I mean, the medical aspect, I mean, that's what got me involved in the first place. For those of you who don't know, I mean, when I got the knock on my door to say, can you help us with these patients, it wasn't because I had any interest necessarily in UAP or UFO. It was because they wanted access to the technology that my lab had developed around blood research. And so I think where that led to, basically us seeing the first of the Havana syndrome patients, I think, basically informed me about the other kinds of trauma that either our defense personnel or intelligence personnel were going through, and the experiencer side. Now, I sometimes get criticized for not wanting to talk about experiencers. It's not because it's just I'm not a psychiatrist and I don't have the qualifications to cover it. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be discussed, and we've had plenty of experiencer groups here. But so my next door neighbor at one point was the chair of psychiatry at Stanford. And when I first started bringing this subject matter up, and it was like a first dinner over at their house, I could just sort of see her moving back in the chair. Until she started hearing more and more of the work that was being done in the area, and she realized that it could be contexted around a mental health problem. It didn't mean that she had to agree with what it was that we were seeing, but like John Mack, she came to understand that this was a problem that was being experienced across a large group of people, and therefore it was probably part of her department's patient subset. Anyway, so she needed to deal with it.
Right, right. And I just sort of salute you for being a leader in that area.
No,
it's
thanks.
a very brave thing to do.
Thanks. So, but I think thank you. I mean, there's a step beyond the mental health, and that's the bodily health. If people have come in contact with field structures that supposedly these craft might allegedly make, what do we learn about the field structures and what it does to humanity? I mean, who do we have to put dogs in space in these objects like we did previously, or chimpanzees, before we use them? Or what kind of test bed systems do you use? And what, I mean, my lab does a lot of animal research, and I don't like it one little bit, but it has to be done instead of making a mistake. So, I think that is something that I would want to understand a little bit about with any of these technologies. What's the safety profile?
Precisely. Yeah. I mean, technology of unknown origin is probably technology of unknown ramification.
Yeah.
And so, that would have to be kept in mind as any policy might be developed.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing this time with Garry, and I appreciate your thoughts on the different Hilbert problems.
Yeah, and thank you. So we've got 54 seconds left for a question. No. Thank you very much, everybody.